pages, additional prosecutorial judgment. That may be accurate, but the standards that you adhere to by the second constitutional body, the executive, in Article 2, has a larger parameters as to whether or not the administration followed the rule of law and actually adhere to guidelines or actions appropriate for a president of the United States. Further, Attorney General attempted to swat away the idea of any Russian coordination. He did that by suggesting that the Attorney Mueller did not find an underlying crime and therefore refused to move forward on the obstruction. Refused to move forward on the obstruction on the basis of not an indictment or a crime, and we also know that Attorney General Barr has already made his point very clear about his position on the indictment of a president. We do not sit here in the role of a grand jury to indict the president, but we sit here as a body that has to proceed with its constitutional duties to provide oversight and transparency. Let me share with my colleagues what has happened in the past. Dan Burton, former chair of the Oversight Committee, issued 1,000 unilateral subpoenas in the 1990s regarding the Clinton administration. Lamar Smith of the Science Committee issued 25 subpoenas in his first year of chairmanship. Before 2015, this committee had not issued one subpoena in 21 years. Chairman Issa issued 100+ subpoenas, exceeding by over 20% the number of subpoenas from Dems and Republicans lawmakers of any committee. And then Chairman Gowdy of the Benghazi Committee, who sent U.S. Marshals to 70 witnesses' homes without asking any one of them to come voluntarily. I frankly believe that we are being both fair and balanced in our efforts.
Gentlewoman, yield.
Be happy to yield.
Just for the record, I was chair of this committee for 6 years, and I didn't sign one subpoena at all. You know, I got what I needed out of the administration without having to compel it. So there's a difference between nice and being less than nice.
Mr. Sensenbrenner, thank you. I'm restoring my time or reclaiming my time. As you well know, you have not been mentioned. You have not been mentioned, nor has the Judiciary Committee been mentioned. But the point being made is that there's been a history of subpoenas offered in other areas and other committees. And in this instance, I think the Judiciary Committee is being extremely fair. So thank you so very much for that clarification that Chairman Sensenbrenner did not. But in this instance, I believe that the committee is being fair. Mr. Nadler is being fair. This is a resolution to authorize the issuance of a subpoena. And I ask my colleagues to support this resolution. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Arizona. From Arizona, Mr. Biggs, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent that an article published April 1st, 2019 in The Atlantic, written by Ben Wittes and entitled "Bill Barr Has Promised Transparency," be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Wittes is the editor-in-chief of Lawfare and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. That's the same think tank where Norm Eisen, a member of the chairman's staff, is also a senior fellow, and Barry Burke, another member of the chairman's staff, has published extensively. And with that, I yield to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Buck.
I thank the gentleman from Arizona. Mr. Chairman, we're discussing basically what the standard is for release of grand jury testimony in the context of an independent counsel or special counsel investigation. And thankfully, you announced the standard on September 9th, 1998, when you appeared on the Charlie Rose Show. That's the same day that independent counsel Ken Starr, and I'll repeat that, the same day that independent counsel Ken Starr delivered his report into the Clinton investigation to Congress. Here's what you said when explaining why it would be unwise and unfair to release grand jury materials. Quote, "Now, Mr. Starr, in his transmittal letter to the Speaker and the Minority Leader, made it clear that much of this material is Federal Rule 6E material. That is material that by law, unless contravened by a vote of the House, must be kept secret. It is grand jury material. It represents statements which may or may not be true by various witnesses. Salacious material, all kinds of material that it would be unfair to release." End of quote. Our chairman even went so far as to suggest in that interview that certain material, quote, must not be released at all, end of quote. I do want to mention that under the Independent Counsel statute, Congress held a statutory role of oversight, so it would have at least been proper for Congress to consider if grand jury materials should be released. But that law has expired. Under current law, the Attorney General is left with the responsibility of protecting grand jury materials. A different person responsible for deciding, different responsibility altogether. Despite changes in the law, the chairman's concerns from 1998 about the questionable value in releasing grand jury material and the need to protect those materials are still true today. The chairman's position was also on display 3 weeks ago when the House unanimously approved his resolution, H-Con Res 24, calling for the release of the Special Counsel report while excluding from disclosure any information protected by law which would necessarily protect grand jury material. Nevertheless, in a New York Times op-ed this week, the chairman wrote, quote, "The Department of Justice has an obligation to provide it," meaning the full Mueller report, "in its entirety without delay." Mr. Chairman, you had it right over 20 years ago. You supported the protection of grand jury information, and I agree with that. You had it right 3 weeks ago. Everyone on this committee voted for your resolution to protect against the release of 6E materials. Mr. Chairman, Attorney General Barr agrees with you. Last week, he wrote to you to tell you that he was working with the special counsel to redact grand jury materials. Your historic standard, one you held for 7,492 days from September 8, 1998, at least until March 14, 2019, is a same standard that can be found in my amendment. The standard says that grand jury materials should not be disclosed. That's the right standard. And I urge the committee to adopt the standard, and I yield back to the gentleman from Arizona.
Reclaiming my time.
Mr. Chairman.
From Rhode Island.
Excuse me, I have time still. I reclaimed my time.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Mr. Biggs, continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the Representative Buck's amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to resolution. And one thing I want to point out is that when I hear people intimate that the chairman merely has the authorization to issue a subpoena, I get this feeling that maybe this isn't a done deal, but it is a done deal, because the chairman, in his response to the gentleman from Wisconsin, said very clearly that before going to court, we're going to issue a subpoena. So the normal process would naturally be to go to the court and ask for this information to be made available, but that's not what's going to happen here. You're going to see subpoenas issued, and they're going to be issued because, as the chairman said in his opening statement, the Attorney General Barr may do this, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, and President Trump may do that. In other words, he would suggest that this would be conditional, but he is acting, and this resolution is going to go forward regardless of what Mr. Barr provides, even if it's in compliance with Rule 6E. My time's expired.
Gentleman from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to make two brief points. One is the gentleman from Wisconsin referenced the Starr report and the Jaworski report as precedent for not issuing a subpoena and, in fact, going to court. It should be noted that in both of those cases, the Special and Independent Counsel went to court to seek authorization for the release of the grand jury testimony before it was delivered to Congress. They did that on their own. It didn't require Congress to litigate it. So those individuals recognized that it was important when they delivered the report to also deliver the underlying documents, and they sought permission from the court to do it. That has not happened in this case. In fact, Mr. Barr has done just the opposite. He's attempted to keep this information from Congress. So the notion that we should just wait and sort of pray and hope that Mr. Barr will suddenly find his way to the courthouse to seek authorization, I think is foolish. This subpoena will require him to take that action, because as the gentleman from Wisconsin said, he could move to quash the subpoena. That's one course of action. He could also go to court and move for the production of 6E material so he can comply with the subpoena. And that's what we're hoping he will do if, in fact, they're interested in getting this information for Congress. So I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment to set the precedent so that, in fact, this committee can get the full report and all the supporting materials so we can do our oversight responsibility. And as the chairman said, our constitutional responsibilities have not changed, even if some regulation has. I urge a no vote on the amendment and yield the balance of my time to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I just want to point out that I was right 21 years ago. I'm right now, and it's totally consistent, because we are urging now that the underlying 6E material be produced to the committee. In 1998, that material had been produced to the Congress, and what we were discussing was its release to the public. And before 6E material is released to the public, it has to be reviewed, because some of it should not be released to the public for privacy and other reasons. But that determination was made then by Congress, and it should be made now by Congress. We are asking now that the material be given to Congress so we can fulfill our constitutional responsibilities. In 1998, the material had been given, or prior to this debate, to Congress, so Congress could fulfill its constitutional responsibilities. And my comments on the floor then and the debate then was not about whether the material should go to Congress. It already had. It was about whether it should be released to the public in its entirety. And I said then that you can't release 6E material entirely to the Republic, I'm sorry, in its entirety to the public without reviewing it. And that's still true, but it should be, but it was then and should be now released to the Congress, to this committee in its entirety.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, I'll yield.
Would the gentleman support releasing to the public the material that we redacted in the Clinton impeachment?
I'll reclaim my time. I'd like to focus on the issue before this committee.
No.
Yeah. I'm reclaiming my time, I think, from the chairman, but I, again, want to suggest that this is an important responsibility of this committee to ensure that it is clear that no one is above the law, that we follow the facts where they lead us, that this investigation was conducted on behalf of the American people. When our democracy was attacked by a foreign adversary, we fought hard to protect Mr. Mueller so he could complete his work free from political interference, and now we have a right, this committee has the right and the responsibility to see the full contents of this report and the supporting materials, and I urge a no on this amendment and yield the balance of my time to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Again, we have the right and the duty to protect certain material from public disclosure, and if we redacted it from the public 20 years ago, I assume we had good reason to do that. But the question before us now is not public release of information, it's release to Congress to do our constitutional duties, and it's a very different situation. I yield back to the gentleman.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Radcliffe, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, I've been listening to the arguments this morning. I've been trying to decide what's worse. Was it last week when within 24 hours of the Attorney General issuing his summary of the Mueller findings, I listened to the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff, demand the immediate full release of the Mueller report without consideration for classified information. The chairman of the Intelligence Committee telling all 17 intelligence agencies over which he had oversight, essentially, I don't give a damn about classified information. I want the full release of that report. Or was it this week when I'm sitting here today listening to the chairman of the Judiciary Committee say, I don't care what the law says. I don't care what the special counsel regulation says. I don't care that the Attorney General has complied with both, that the Attorney General has done everything the law requires, everything the special counsel regulations require, and is promising to do more, but that's not good enough, and now he's going to be subpoenaed for that. In that theater of the absurd, I'm still trying to decide which of those is worse. The Attorney General didn't comply with the Democrats' arbitrary April 2nd demand deadline because he can't comply, because the law precludes him from complying, because the Attorney General wasn't going to commit crimes to comply with that deadline. Mr. Chairman, today I heard you say over and over again, Congress requires, there are constitutional rights, or there's a necessity for this information. What I didn't hear was what law, the special counsel, where in the special counsel regulation does it say that the Attorney General must turn over an unredacted full special counsel report? The special counsel regulation doesn't say that. No law says that. The Attorney General has promised to provide as much transparency as he possibly can, but I'm afraid that's never going to be good enough for some in here. And that's because we're here having this argument because some, not all, of my Democratic colleagues promised the American people evidence that never existed. Some, not all, Democrats shouted fire in the theater of the American public, feeding a false Trump-Russia collusion narrative that never existed and that, in fact, some Democrats created with a fake, phony dossier. Now, Special Counsel Mueller, who some Democrats demanded be protected so that he could do his job, did his job. And the minute that he finished doing that job and said, no collusion, that the Trump-Russia collusion narrative doesn't exist, is not real, protect Bob Mueller suddenly has become to hell with Bob Mueller. I have always believed that Bob Mueller could write the definitive narrative on how Russia tried to meddle in our election. I have never called what Bob Mueller was doing in that regard a witch hunt. But Bob Mueller has provided his findings to the Attorney General, who has accurately summarized those. And with respect to Trump-Russia collusion, Bob Mueller has said there are no witches. So these investigations should end. We should move on. We shouldn't be issuing subpoenas today. But if we're going to issue subpoenas today, let's not issue a subpoena for the Mueller report. Let's issue one for Bob Mueller.
Would the gentleman yield? Would the gentleman yield for a question?
Let me finish this thought. Let Bob Mueller come, and let's ask Bob Mueller whether or not he thinks that the report that he created should be disclosed without considerations for redactions of classified national security information, or without redactions for grand jury information, or other information relating to ongoing investigations. I may have questioned Bob Mueller's actions in certain regards, but I have never questioned his integrity, and I would be happy to hear his answer under oath before this committee with respect to that issue. So I urge all my colleagues to follow the law and to therefore support the Buck Amendment. And I yield to the gentleman from Georgia.
Tennessee. Way beyond. Gentleman's time has expired.
Well done. Yield back.
Gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to say, Mr. Ratcliffe, who I respect greatly, said that Mr. Barr accurately described in the Mueller report. We don't know that. That's why we want to see it, so we can know if he accurately did it. He talked about people who threw fire. He might be suggesting, I'm one of those fire throwers. I want to find out if I was wrong, and I want the public to see it too. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got to say, I've witnessed one of the proof positive of the brilliant mental acumen of our chairman as he explained adroitly how he was right 21 years ago and is right today. Just a work of beauty in that argument. As chairman said, 21 years ago, we should always remember this is a prosecutor's report. By its nature, it's one-sided. He also said it was salacious material, all kinds of material that it would be unfair to release. I would point out the gentleman didn't know exactly what all the material was at that time, and we don't know at this time either. In a February 1999 New York Times article, Our current chairman called the Starr Report impeachment efforts a, quote, partisan coup d'etat, unquote. What has gone on in this country did absolutely, unequivocally, no doubt about it, involve collusion of people at the highest level with a foreign entity to try to bring down a candidate and then bring down a sitting president. That was collusion between top FBI officials, justice officials, a former MI6 intelligence officer who has been discredited by those same justice officials, FBI officials, but they colluded with him to try to bring down a candidate and now a sitting president. Enough is enough. At some point, we've got to say what will be written in the annals of history of this country as an outrageous attempt at a real coup d'etat was unsuccessful. The truth came out about who really colluded with foreign agents. And by the way, that did involve the Democrats' campaign and a foreign agent who was colluding with some of Putin's agents in all likelihood, as he was not even in Russia, but was talking by phone to Russian agents in his efforts to help the Clinton campaign and top justice officials bring down a sitting president. And for us to continue this outrageous assault on the office of president, even after the truth has come out that there was no conspiracy by the Trump campaign or President Trump or anybody in his family with Russia, and to continue to push, we're still going to make a big deal out of this. We can't stand the fact that the facts show it was the Democrats that colluded with foreign agents to try to change the outcome of the election. Enough is enough, for heaven's sakes. Let's please move on. There was a time when I loved and appreciated the current chairman's desire to protect privacy rights. I saw that dramatically eroded during the Obama administration, but I am still hoping and praying that our now chairman's once great desire to protect privacy rights and to try to hold back the bounds of what Orwell described as happening now. Obviously, the only thing he got wrong was the year, because we've seen what the Obama administration did with those Orwellian abilities to spy on American citizens. It's time to go back and clean up the mess that's been made over years of abuse. And this subpoena, the subpoenas, is not what we need to be voting for. And I support my friend's amendment. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Arizona. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Yield to the gentlelady from Texas.
Thank you very much. I wanted to read into the record the information regarding the chairman of the Benghazi Committee sent U.S. Marshals to a witness house without making without asking that witness to come in voluntarily. And I yield back to the gentleman.
The gentleman from Georgia yield back.
I yield back.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you. The gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I support Representative Buck's amendment. What basically we're doing here is, in my opinion, the Democrats are asking Attorney General Barr to violate the law. It's not only against the law, but it would even be criminal to disclose grand jury material without a court order. It's obvious to me that this is just a continuation of an attempt to undermine the President of the United States. For the last 2 years, Members on this committee have said that there has been collusion with the Trump administration and President Trump with Russia to undermine the 2016 election, and as revealed in the summary, this is absolutely not true. So I really wish that we could work on big issues instead of continuing this circus on undermining the President of the United States. I serve on 3 committees, and in every single committee, it is obvious from the very first organizational meeting that there is a coordinated attempt by the Democrats to undermine the President of the United States, and this is all about the 2020 presidential election. The public really wants us to work on big issues together, and I ask my Democratic colleagues to do that and quit this circus. I will yield time to the gentleman, Mr. Jordan from Ohio.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding, and I too wish to support the Buck Amendment. I would just ask the fundamental question: why are we here? Seems to me we're here because the Mueller report wasn't what the Democrats thought it was going to be. In fact, it was just the opposite. What did the Attorney General tell us that the principal finding of Mr. Mueller's report were? No new indictments, no sealed indictments, no collusion, no obstruction. On the
Mr.
question,
Jordan, will the gentleman yield?
I only got a little bit of time because
I only have a short question. You made reference to the Mueller report. Have you seen it? Because we haven't.
No, I've seen the principal findings from the Attorney General.
Would the gentleman yield for a quick question? I promise it's short. Mr. Jordan? You reported that the report states that there's no obstruction. What's your basis for saying that?
The sentence where he said they did not find obstruction. I understand the sentence you're referring to where he talks about no exoneration either, but then there are 3 paragraphs after where he points out that there was not the elements of obstruction. In fact, the report, the letter from the Attorney General referencing the Special Counsel report said no new indictments, no sealed indictments, no collusion, and as I just pointed out, did not find obstruction. On the question of collusion, was very clear. He said there were multiple opportunities for people associated with the Trump campaign to collude, and they didn't. So multiple times where the forbidden fruit was placed in front of them and they didn't bite. But all that does, I would also point out this. There's been reference from the Democrats relative to Watergate and the Clinton special counsel. Watergate, there was a break-in. With Clinton, there was perjury. With the chief charge of this special counsel's investigation, there was no collusion. But here we are today. Well, actually 3 weeks ago, the chairman of the committee launched 81 letters to 60-some different individuals. And now today we're going to subpoena documents that the AG said he will give us in a matter of days. But maybe the most important point, I think, is the one that my colleague from Texas made, Mr. Ratcliffe. The idea that the chairman of the Intelligence Committee said he wants everything made public, including classified information, and the idea that the chair of the Judiciary Committee, the House Judiciary Committee, said this week that he wants everything made public, including grand jury material, that's maybe the scariest thing of all. So the Attorney General has said he's going to turn this over in a matter of days. Let's wait. Let's get the information, and then let's look at it then. With that, I would yield back the remaining 20 seconds to the gentlelady from Arizona.
I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates.
Move to strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I support the Buck Amendment. When the human body sees life expire within it, one of the final sounds that it can make in dramatic and loud fashion is a death rattle. And I would suggest to the American people that what they're witnessing is the death rattle of the Democrats' Russia collusion lie. For 22 months, my colleagues on the other side, many of them said there was actual evidence of collusion. And so now, clearly seeing that that is not true, we observe our colleagues moving through the stages of grief. First, we saw shock and surprise. My colleagues would huddle together after the findings of the Mueller report were released, wondering what to do next, what play to run after losing all credibility with the American people. And after shock, we now are in the stage of denial, where the principal findings of the Mueller report, they just can't be true. They can't be accepted. They must be false. There must be more information we can discover. I know we're beginning the baseball season, so perhaps a baseball analogy would be appropriate. This would be like saying, well, we've lost the game, but we have to tweeze through the box score to see if we won the third inning. That's what is essentially happening with the desire of Democrats in the production of these subpoenas and voting on them today. It also represents a stark departure from the standards and statements that my own Democratic colleagues have laid out just last Congress and this Congress. I'm quoting now from the Speaker of the House, Ms. Pelosi, in February of 2018. She said, President Trump has surrendered his constitutional responsibility as commander-in-chief by releasing highly classified and distorted intelligence, by not protecting intelligence sources and methods. He just sent his friend Putin a bouquet. Well, there was no bouquet, no untoward relationship with Vladimir Putin, but there was a statement from the Speaker of the House acknowledging that if you do not review sources and methods, you are derelict in your duty to the country. Well, now that they're going through their stages of grief, perhaps we're approaching bargaining, because now they're trying to bargain away their own standards. But it's not just the Speaker of the House. Let's look to statements from the Chairman of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler. He said on June 28th of 2018, Republicans are requesting documents they know they cannot have. He continued, and if the majority, speaking of the Republicans, is rightly denied, they will do their best to undermine the credibility of the Department of Justice. Well, Mr. Chairman, you are now asking for documents you know you cannot have. And you're doing so in order to erode confidence in the Attorney General who leads the Department of Justice, because he has concluded that there was not collusion and that your principal Russian narrative was not truthful, was not credible. We were right, you were wrong, and the American people know it. And so as we proceed now on this unfocused 81-pronged investigation that the Judiciary Committee has launched, as we continue to have these mindless votes on unnecessary subpoenas, I sincerely hope that the American people will remember what things the Democrats were saying just months ago, that there was collusion, that there was actual evidence of collusion, and that sources and methods could never be disclosed as a consequence of our fidelity to our oath and to the people of this country. Let's have some consistency, and let's at least have some acknowledgement that you all were not telling the truth to the American people for an extended period of time. We were, and you should not be trusted. I yield back.
The question occurs on the amendment. All those in favor of the Buck Amendment will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, ask for a recorded vote.
A roll call vote has been requested. As your name is called, all those in favor will signify by saying aye. Opposed, no. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson-Lee? Ms. Jackson-Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes no. Ms. Bass? Mr. Richmond? Mr. Richmond votes no. Mr. Jeffries?
No.
Mr. Jeffries votes no. Mr. Cicilline?
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu? Mr. Liu votes no. Mr. Raskin? No. Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Demings? No. Ms. Demings votes no. Mr. Correa? No. Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon? No. Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia?
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath? No. Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton?
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean?
No.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. McCarcel-Powell? Ms. McCarcel-Powell votes no. Ms. Escobar?
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Collins? Yes. Mr. Collins votes yes. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Sensenbrenner votes aye. Mr. Shavit? Mr. Shavit votes aye. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Ratcliffe? Mr. Ratcliffe votes yes. Ms. Roby? Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Ms. Lesko? Ms. Lesko votes aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler votes aye. Mr. Klein?
Aye.
Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Armstrong? Yes. Mr. Armstrong votes yes. Mr. Stubbe? Yes. Mr. Stubbe votes yes.
Clerk will report. One more, please. The clerk will suspend.
Ms. Fast votes no.
Has everyone else voted? The clerk will report.
Ms. Jackson Lee is recorded as no.
They're not leaving. You have no vote. Do they know that? They're not leaving. You have no vote.
Mr. Chairman, the vote is 16 ayes and 24 noes.
A majority having voted against the amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other amendments? Is another amendment? Gentleman is recognized.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I called for the
Wait a minute, the clerk will report the amendment. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I called for the appointment of a special counsel to look into charges of collusion before Mr. Mueller was appointed because I believe the president was completely innocent of these outlandish charges and that a full and independent investigation would show that. Now it has. And I, too, want to see as much of the report made public as quickly as humanly possible to put the lie to these politicians who've been telling us for more than 2 years that they held in their hands irrefutable evidence of coordination between the Russian government and the Trump campaign. I want to know all aspects of this lie and who was responsible for using it to tear this country apart and to interfere with the legitimate election of the president. But what I don't want to do is illegally release material in that report that is related to ongoing investigations into political corruption at the highest levels of the FBI and the Justice Department. It is clear that high-ranking officials entrusted with the law enforcement powers of our country abused this trust to influence the 2016 presidential election and ultimately to undermine its outcome. It is inconceivable that the Mueller investigation did not look into the fake Steele dossier that was the source of these outlandish charges and was knowingly invoked by these officials in their attempt to delegitimize the constitutional right of the American people to elect their president. The premature release of such information while the Inspector General is conducting investigations into this matter and while future prosecutions of these officials is possible would itself be a deliberate and calculated attempt to obstruct justice by this committee, and I'm opposed to the motion.
The question occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no? No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. A reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to agree to the resolution as amended. Those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? No. The ayes have it. The resolution. A recorded vote has been requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Bass? Mr. Richmond? Mr. Richmond votes aye. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Jeffries votes aye. Mr. Cicilline?
Aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Liu?
Aye.
Mr. Liu votes aye. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Demings? Ms. Demings votes aye. Mr. Correa? Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon? Aye. Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia?
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton?
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean?
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Mucarsel-Powell?
Aye.
Ms. Mucarsel-Powell votes aye. Ms. Escobar?
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Collins? Ms. Bass? Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Collins?
No.
Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner? No. Mr. Sensenbrenner votes no. Mr. Shabbat? No. Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Gomert votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Buck? No. Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Ratcliffe? Ms. Roby? Ms. Roby votes no. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes no. Ms. Lesko? Ms. Lesko votes no. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler votes no. Mr. Klein?
No.
Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Stubbe votes no.
Has every member voted who wishes to vote?
Chairman, how am I recorded?
Ms. Jackson Lee, you are not recorded.
Aye.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye.
Gentleman from Texas,
Mr. Ratcliffe votes no.
does any other member wish to vote who hasn't voted? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, the vote is 24 ayes, 17 noes.
The ayes have it. The resolution is amended as agreed to. This concludes our business for today. Thanks to all of our members for attending. The markup is adjourned.